Trash belongs in the kitchen, not in front of billionaires. The words cracked through the private dining room like a champagne glass shattering on marble. Conversations stopped. Forks froze halfway to perfectly tailored mouths. Even the soft jazz drifting from the grand piano suddenly seemed too loud. Under the amber glow of crystal chandeliers inside Maison Lumiere, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, every head turned toward table 12. Standing beside it, holding a silver tray with 2 untouched glasses of Napa Valley Cabernet, was Naomi Brooks. 29 years old. Black. Elegant in a simple black server's uniform. Calm. Unmoving. Across from her sat Ethan Caldwell, founder and CEO of Caldwell Dynamics, a technology empire valued at nearly $12 billion. At 38, Ethan had become the kind of man magazines called visionary and employees called terrifying when he wasn't around. His custom navy suit fit perfectly. His platinum watch cost more than most Americans earned in a year. And tonight, surrounded by investors preparing to finalize a $500 million acquisition, Ethan looked annoyed. A few drops of sparkling water had landed on the sleeve of his jacket when another guest accidentally bumped the table. Naomi had immediately offered a fresh linen napkin. Ethan interpreted it as incompetence. "Did you hear me?" he asked, louder this time, leaning back in his leather chair. "I said get this trash away from my table." A nervous laugh escaped from one executive. Nobody else joined in. Because something felt wrong. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't lower her eyes. She simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, hands steady, meeting Ethan's stare with a quiet composure that somehow made the billionaire increasingly uncomfortable. What Ethan Caldwell didn't know, what nobody at table 12 understood, was that he had just insulted the most powerful person in the building. But that truth would come later. For now, the room only saw a black waitress being humiliated by a powerful CEO. And to most people in rooms like this, that wasn't unusual. Naomi Brooks had spent years mastering invisibility. Guests often remembered the wine she recommended but never her name. They remembered the flawless service, the warm bread baskets, the polished silver, but rarely the woman carrying them. Yet there was something different about Naomi. The veteran staff noticed it immediately when she first appeared 3 years earlier. She moved through the restaurant with unusual confidence. Managers sought her opinion. Chefs greeted her with genuine respect. Even the notoriously demanding maitre d', Victor Hale, softened whenever Naomi walked by. New employees whispered theories. Some thought she came from old money. Others believed she had once been a corporate executive. Naomi never corrected anyone. She simply worked. Every Friday night. Without fail. Back at table 12, Ethan shook his head dismissively and turned toward Victor, who had just rushed into the room, his expression tense. "Fire her," Ethan said coldly. "Immediately. Unless losing my business sounds more appealing." Victor opened his mouth, closed it, looked briefly toward Naomi. And in that strange, suspended silence, several employees exchanged the same expression. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was pity. And Ethan Caldwell, a man who believed he understood power better than anyone, failed to notice it. Victor Hale had managed luxury restaurants for almost 25 years, and in all that time, he had learned one rule above all others. Never embarrass a billionaire in public. But standing inside the private dining room of Maison Lumiere, staring at Ethan Caldwell and then at Naomi Brooks, Victor found himself trapped between two forces far more dangerous than money. "Mr. Caldwell," Victor said carefully, forcing a polite smile, "perhaps we can discuss this privately." Ethan frowned immediately. He was not a man accustomed to resistance, especially not from hospitality staff. "There is nothing to discuss," he replied, his voice sharp enough to silence the room again. "Your employee insulted my guests by interrupting our conversation, spilled water on my jacket, and now she is standing here staring at me. I want her removed." Naomi remained perfectly still. "Sir," she said softly, "I apologized for the inconvenience and offered assistance." Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Do not patronize me." Several executives around the table shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Most of them had worked with Ethan for years. They knew his temper. They also knew that once Ethan decided someone had crossed him, he rarely backed down. Yet something about tonight felt different. Across the room, one of the senior sommeliers quietly stepped backward and disappeared through the service entrance. A hostess near the doorway whispered something into her headset. Within seconds, subtle movement spread through the restaurant floor like a ripple across still water. Naomi noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything. She always had. Long before Maison Lumiere became one of the most coveted reservations in New York City, Naomi had learned that true leadership rarely announced itself. It observed. It listened. It paid attention to details others ignored. Growing up in Brooklyn, Naomi had watched her mother work double shifts as a nurse while still finding time to cook dinner every night. People show you who they are when they think you cannot change their lives, her mother often said. Naomi never forgot those words. They had shaped every decision she made as an adult. Especially after success found her. Especially after wealth arrived. At table 12, Ethan stood from his chair. 6 feet 2 inches tall, confident, commanding, accustomed to controlling every room he entered. I am giving you one opportunity, he told Victor. Either she leaves, or my company does. And, trust me, you do not want to explain that to ownership. A silence followed. A long one. Victor lowered his eyes for a moment. When he looked up again, there was something almost sympathetic in his expression. Mr. Caldwell, he said quietly, with all due respect, I believe that decision may not be mine to make. Ethan blinked. Excuse me. Before Victor could answer, the private dining room doors opened. 2 impeccably dressed executives entered. Behind them came the executive chef, the director of operations, and the head of guest relations. None of them looked at Ethan. Every single one walked directly toward Naomi. Then, almost simultaneously, they stopped. Good evening, Ms. Brooks, the director of operations said warmly. We apologize for the disturbance. Is everything all right? The temperature inside the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ethan stared. Around him, investors exchanged confused glances. For the first time that evening, the billionaire CEO found himself in unfamiliar territory. He no longer understood what was happening. And in rooms built on power, confusion is often the first crack before everything collapses. For 3 full seconds, nobody spoke. The silence inside the private dining room felt almost unnatural, heavy enough to press against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. Ethan Caldwell looked from one executive to another, expecting someone to explain why senior leadership from the restaurant had just assembled around a waitress, as if she were the guest of honor. Instead, every face remained composed, respectful, deliberate. Naomi offered a small, reassuring smile to the gathering staff. Thank you, everyone, she said calmly. I appreciate your concern. Please return to your guests. I will handle this. No one hesitated. No one questioned her. The executives nodded immediately. Of course, Ms. Brooks, Victor replied. One by one, they quietly exited the room. The doors closed softly behind them. But the damage had already been done. Ethan felt it. The balance inside the room had shifted. Investors who moments earlier had laughed nervously at his remarks now studied him with growing uncertainty. One board member from Chicago adjusted his glasses and leaned toward another executive. Who exactly is she? He whispered. Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Not yet. Ethan straightened his jacket. Interesting management structure you have here, he said, forcing a thin smile. Although I assume this performance is designed to make some kind of point. Naomi gently placed the silver tray onto a nearby service station. No performance, Mr. Caldwell, she replied. Only professionalism. Ethan folded his arms. Professionalism would have been removing yourself from my table when asked. Naomi met his eyes again. There was no anger there. No humiliation. Only calm. And somehow, that calm unsettled him more than outrage ever could. Men like Ethan understood conflict. They understood competition. They understood power struggles. But they often struggled with something far more dangerous. Grace. Because grace cannot be controlled. It cannot be intimidated. It simply exists. Tell me something, Ethan said. How long have you worked here? A few employees standing near the doorway exchanged quick glances. Naomi noticed, but answered anyway. 3 years. Ethan nodded slowly, almost satisfied. Then perhaps you should remember who keeps places like this profitable. Naomi's expression never changed. Actually, Mr. Caldwell, I know exactly what keeps places like this profitable. Again, silence. Again, confusion. One investor from California quietly set down his wine glass. He had spent 20 years negotiating billion-dollar acquisitions, and he recognized a pattern. People who possess real authority rarely announce it. They do not need to. Ethan, however, remained unaware. You know, he said, glancing around the room, I built my company from nothing. When I was 24, I was sleeping in my office and surviving on takeout food. I earned everything I have. I respect hard work. But respect also requires knowing your place. The sentence landed heavily across the table. Naomi looked toward the panoramic skyline beyond the glass windows. Thousands of city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. New York. A city that had once told her she did not belong. A city she eventually transformed anyway. She turned back toward Ethan. My mother used to say something very different, Naomi said softly. She taught me that a person's place is never determined by the uniform they wear. Ethan was about to respond when a soft chime echoed throughout the room. Every digital display inside Maison Lumiere suddenly illuminated. Menus. Reservation screens. Guest welcome displays. Simultaneously, across every screen in the restaurant, elegant gold lettering appeared against a black background. Welcome, Ms. Naomi Brooks. Ownership access verified. A round table. 12 faces drained of color. Ethan stared at the nearest screen. Then back at Naomi. For the first time that evening, the billionaire CEO looked genuinely speechless. The room did not erupt into chaos. It did something far more revealing. It went silent. Complete silence. The kind that exposes every careless word spoken only moments earlier. Ethan Caldwell stared at the glowing screen nearest him, convinced there had been some mistake. Ownership access verified. The words remained unchanged. Around him, executives shifted uneasily in their chairs. One investor quietly reached for his water glass. Another lowered his eyes altogether. Across the table, Naomi Brooks stood with the same quiet composure she had carried all evening. Nothing about her expression suggested triumph. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply looked like a woman who had seen this exact moment before. Many times. Ethan finally found his voice. You own this restaurant? He asked. The confidence that had filled his tone earlier had faded, replaced by something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Naomi nodded once. Yes. Ethan laughed softly, but the sound felt forced. You expect me to believe that you are the owner of one of the most profitable restaurants in Manhattan, yet you spend Friday nights serving tables? I do not expect you to believe anything, Mr. Caldwell, Naomi replied. Facts exist whether people believe them or not. Several guests lowered their heads, hiding reluctant smiles. Ethan noticed. His jaw tightened. For years, he had built his reputation on reading people, controlling negotiations, anticipating weaknesses. Yet somehow he had completely misjudged the person standing directly in front of him. What unsettled him even more was that everyone else in the room now realized it too. Victor quietly stepped forward carrying a leather portfolio. Mr. Caldwell, he said respectfully, Ms. Brooks founded Brooks Hospitality Group 6 years ago. He opened the portfolio and placed several framed magazine covers on the table. Forbes, Fortune, Fast Company. On every cover appeared the same familiar face. Naomi Brooks. CEO. Entrepreneur. Hospitality visionary. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He recognized the company immediately. Brooks Hospitality Group had transformed struggling luxury properties across the country into thriving businesses worth nearly $1 billion. Business schools taught case studies about Naomi's management philosophy. Industry conferences competed to secure her as a keynote speaker. Ironically, Ethan had once quoted one of her interviews during a leadership summit in San Francisco. Yet he had never connected the woman on those magazine covers with the waitress standing beside his table. Because he had never truly looked at her. 3 years ago, Victor continued carefully, Ms. Brooks purchased Maison Lumière after the previous ownership group declared bankruptcy. Most experts predicted the restaurant would close within 6 months. Victor smiled faintly. Instead, revenue increased by 240%. The room remained silent. Outside, Manhattan glittered beneath the night sky, unaware that inside one private dining room, an entirely different kind of market correction was taking place. Ethan slowly sat back down. For the first time in years, he felt profoundly unprepared. Naomi walked toward the panoramic windows overlooking the city. I continue serving tables because spreadsheets cannot tell me how guests feel, she said quietly. Titles cannot teach empathy. And ownership means very little if you forget the experience of the people doing the work. She turned toward the room. Every Friday, I wear this uniform because leadership should never become so comfortable that it loses perspective. No one spoke. Because everyone understood that the lesson was no longer about restaurants. It was about character. And in that moment, the most powerful man in the room was no longer Ethan Caldwell. The revelation should have ended the evening. In most rooms, it would have. Apologies would have followed. Hands would have been shaken. The incident would have quietly disappeared beneath expensive wine and forced laughter. But power has a peculiar effect on certain people. It convinces them that surrender is weakness. And Ethan Caldwell had spent his entire adult life refusing to surrender. He leaned back slowly in his chair, folding his hands together as if reclaiming control through sheer force of habit. Impressive, he said at last, his voice measured. You built quite a brand. Naomi simply nodded. Thank you. Ethan glanced around the table, noticing the expectant expressions directed toward him. Investors, advisors, board members, men and women who had spent years watching him dominate negotiations. He could feel their eyes studying him now. Waiting, judging. Still, Ethan continued, ownership does not excuse poor service. Several people visibly winced. Across the room, Victor closed his eyes for a brief moment. Naomi, however, remained composed. I agree, she said calmly. Ethan appeared almost encouraged by her response. Good. Then perhaps we can speak honestly. He stood once more, straightening his cufflinks. My company was considering Maison Lumière for our annual Global Leadership Summit. A 3-day event. Nearly 400 executives. Approximately $6 million in revenue. He paused deliberately. Given tonight's experience, I think we will need to explore other venues. A quiet murmur spread around the table. $6 million was not insignificant, even for a successful luxury property. Ethan noticed the reaction and mistook it for victory. Business is business, he said with a small shrug. I am sure you understand. Naomi studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled. Not a defensive smile. Not an angry one. A genuinely sympathetic smile. And somehow, that unsettled Ethan more than anything else had all evening. Mr. Caldwell, she said softly, Maison Lumière has always been selective about partnerships. Ethan frowned. Selective? Yes. Naomi walked toward the table and gently placed a leather folder in front of him. Your team submitted an event proposal 3 weeks ago. Ethan looked down. His company's logo appeared clearly on the cover. Confusion crossed his face. How did you? Naomi continued. I personally review every corporate partnership valued above $1 million. Slowly, Ethan opened the folder. Inside sat a single document. Across the top, in elegant gold lettering, were 2 words. Application declined. Ethan stared at the page. Declined? Naomi nodded. Last Monday. That is impossible, Ethan said immediately. No one informed us. Actually, Naomi replied, an email was sent to your office 48 hours ago. Victor quietly stepped forward holding a tablet. After several taps, he displayed a copy of the message. Delivered. Opened. Archived. The timestamp appeared unmistakably. One of Ethan's assistants had apparently dismissed it without mentioning it. Around the table, expressions shifted again. This time, several investors looked openly concerned. Ethan felt heat rising into his face. On what basis? He asked, struggling to maintain composure. Naomi answered without hesitation. Our leadership review committee researches every potential client. She paused. Your employee retention rates are among the lowest in the industry. Former staff interviews consistently describe a culture of fear rather than collaboration. And Maison Lumiere does not host organizations whose values conflict with our own. The words landed quietly. But quiet truths often carry the greatest weight. Nobody at the table argued, because many of them had heard similar criticisms before. They had simply never expected to hear them spoken aloud. Ethan looked around the room and realized something terrifying. For the first time in years, nobody was rushing to defend him. The silence that followed felt different now. Earlier, it had been the silence of surprise. This was the silence of recognition. Around table 12, executives who had spent years excusing Ethan Caldwell's behavior suddenly found themselves confronting it through someone else's eyes. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls, but inside Maison Lumiere, nobody seemed interested in the view anymore. Every gaze remained fixed on Ethan. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Men who rise to the top of billion-dollar industries develop an instinct for shifting power. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan realized the room was no longer moving with him. It was moving away from him. Former employees can say anything they want, Ethan said finally, his voice controlled but noticeably tighter. Success creates resentment. That is hardly unusual. Naomi nodded thoughtfully. You are right. Success does create resentment sometimes. She paused. But patterns create truth. Ethan said nothing. Naomi continued. When one person complains, it may be personal. When hundreds describe the same culture, leaders should listen. Several people at the table shifted uncomfortably. One senior vice president quietly lowered his eyes. Another stared into his untouched wine glass. They had all heard the stories. The late-night resignations. The burnout. The constant turnover. They had simply learned not to discuss them in Ethan's presence. Naomi walked slowly toward the panoramic windows again. 5 years ago, she said softly, I almost lost everything. The room grew still. My first restaurant failed within 18 months. I blamed the economy, the location, investors, everyone except myself. She smiled faintly at the memory. Then one dishwasher quit. Before leaving, he handed me a letter. Ethan looked up despite himself. The letter said that I had built a beautiful restaurant where employees felt invisible. Naomi glanced toward the dining room outside, where servers moved gracefully between tables. I spent an entire weekend reading every exit interview we had ignored. Every complaint. Every criticism. She turned back toward the room. The hardest conversations saved my company. Her words lingered in the air. Because everyone recognized their truth. Pride often protects success in the short term. But humility sustains it. A soft vibration suddenly interrupted the moment. Then another. Then several more. Phones began lighting up around the table almost simultaneously. One executive frowned as he checked his screen. Another looked visibly alarmed. Ethan retrieved his own phone. His expression changed instantly. Someone had uploaded a video. The opening seconds showed him standing beside the table, clearly audible. The words he had spoken earlier echoed from the screen. Within minutes, the clip had already accumulated thousands of views. The comments were arriving even faster. A board member leaned toward Ethan. This is spreading. Quickly, he whispered. Ethan stared at the screen. For years, his public image had been carefully managed. Interviews, magazine covers, leadership podcasts, investor conferences. Entire teams existed to protect the Caldwell brand. Yet in less than 20 minutes, a single moment had accomplished what competitors had failed to do for years. It had revealed character without public relations. Ethan slowly lowered the phone. Across the room, Naomi remained calm. She had not recorded the video. She had not shared it. She had not even looked at it. Because she understood something many powerful people never learn. Reputation is not destroyed by exposure. It is destroyed by behavior. And sometimes, the world simply witnesses what was already there. By 9:30 that evening, the video had crossed 1 million views. Nobody inside the private dining room knew the exact number yet, but they could feel it happening. Phones continued vibrating every few seconds. Notifications arrived faster than anyone could read them. Outside the glass walls, the restaurant remained elegantly composed. Guests laughed softly. Crystal glasses clinked. Jazz floated through the air. But inside table 12, the atmosphere had changed completely. Ethan Caldwell sat silently, staring at his dark phone screen. For perhaps the first time in his professional life, he was not thinking about market shares, acquisitions, or quarterly earnings. He was replaying a single sentence. Trash belongs in the kitchen. The words sounded different now. Smaller. Crueler. More revealing. Across the table, one of Ethan's oldest investors, Margaret Sinclair, quietly placed her napkin beside her plate. At 62, Margaret had helped build 3 Fortune 500 companies. She had seen brilliant leaders rise and collapse. She understood that arrogance rarely destroys careers overnight. It erodes them slowly, one unchecked moment at a time. "Ethan," she said gently, breaking the silence, "perhaps it is time to stop defending yourself and start listening." Ethan looked at her in surprise. Margaret had supported him for nearly a decade. She had defended him during difficult board meetings and public controversies. Hearing disappointment in her voice unsettled him more than the viral video ever could. Before Ethan could respond, another voice spoke. "I agree." It came from Daniel Reeves, Caldwell Dynamics' chief financial officer. Ethan turned immediately. Daniel rarely disagreed with him publicly. In fact, Daniel almost never disagreed with him at all. "Our turnover rate has cost us nearly $80 million over the last 3 years, Daniel said carefully. Human resources has been raising concerns for some time. Ethan stared at him. "And you are bringing this up now?" Daniel hesitated. No one felt comfortable bringing it up before. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Because everybody understood what it meant. Fear had become normal. Silence had become culture. Around the table, several executives quietly nodded. One senior vice president spoke next. Then another. Stories emerged. Talented employees leaving. Managers afraid to offer honest feedback. Teams exhausted by impossible expectations. None of it was new information. Yet hearing it spoken openly transformed everything. Naomi listened quietly. She did not interrupt. She did not judge. Because she recognized this moment. Years earlier, she had sat in a nearly identical room listening to difficult truths about herself. Growth rarely begins with inspiration. It begins with discomfort. Finally, Ethan looked toward Naomi. His expression had changed. The sharp edges were gone. In their place sat something unfamiliar. Reflection. "You really still work these shifts every Friday?" he asked quietly. Naomi nodded. "Every Friday." "Why?" Naomi smiled softly. "Because uniforms remind us who we serve." She looked around the room. Success creates distance. Ritual creates perspective. Ethan lowered his eyes. For years, he had measured leadership through control, efficiency, and results. But standing inside Maison Lumière, surrounded by people suddenly willing to speak honestly, he began to suspect that leadership might require something else entirely. Humility. Outside the private dining room, a young server passed carrying dessert plates. Naomi thanked her by name as she walked by. The server smiled. Instantly. A small moment. Easy to overlook. Yet Ethan noticed it. For perhaps the first time all evening, he noticed everything. When the dinner finally ended, nobody reached for dessert. The untouched chocolate soufflés sat beneath silver covers, slowly cooling under the soft amber lights. Conversations that had once revolved around acquisitions and expansion strategies had disappeared entirely. One by one, investors quietly excused themselves. Some offered polite goodbyes. Others simply nodded and left. The atmosphere felt less like the conclusion of a business dinner and more like the aftermath of a difficult truth finally spoken aloud. Ethan Caldwell remained seated long after everyone else had stood. Through the towering windows, Manhattan glittered beneath the late-night sky, indifferent to human pride and human failure alike. His phone rested on the table beside him. He had stopped checking it nearly 30 minutes earlier. There was no point anymore. The numbers had become impossible to ignore. The video had surpassed 8 million views. National media outlets had already begun reporting the story. Several prominent business commentators questioned whether Caldwell Dynamics truly reflected the leadership values it publicly promoted. More troubling still, members of Ethan's board had begun requesting an emergency meeting. Reputation, Ethan was learning, travels at the speed of light in the digital age. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Daniel Reeves approached quietly. "The board wants to meet tomorrow morning," he said gently. Ethan nodded without looking up. "I assumed they would." Daniel hesitated. "There is something else." Ethan finally raised his eyes. "Two major partners have postponed negotiations until after the review." Ethan absorbed the news silently. Under different circumstances, he might have reacted defensively. He might have blamed public perception, social media outrage, or corporate politics. But tonight felt different. Tonight, excuses seemed strangely useless. Across the dining room, Naomi continued helping staff clear tables. She stacked plates, wiped down service stations, thanked employees as they prepared to leave. Nobody watching would have guessed she owned a hospitality empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet somehow, that was precisely the point. Ethan observed quietly. Success had never changed Naomi's willingness to serve. But success had unquestionably changed him. Around 10:15, Ethan stood and slowly walked toward her. Several employees noticed immediately. The room grew quiet again, though for an entirely different reason this time. Ethan stopped a few feet away. For a moment, he said nothing. Words, the tools he had wielded so confidently all evening, suddenly felt inadequate. Finally, he spoke. "Ms. Brooks." Naomi looked up. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan took a breath. "I owe you an apology." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. "What I said earlier was disrespectful," Ethan continued. "Not because you own this restaurant. It would have been wrong regardless." Naomi studied him carefully. Sincerity can be difficult to recognize. But so can regret. "Thank you," she said softly. Ethan nodded once. "I spent years believing leadership meant demanding excellence from others." He glanced around the restaurant. "Tonight, I realized leadership probably begins with how you treat people when you believe they cannot affect your future." Naomi smiled gently. "People always affect our future, Mr. Caldwell. We simply do not always realize it in the moment." Ethan looked around Maison Lumiere one final time. The servers, the hosts, the dishwashers moving quietly in the background. People he likely would not have noticed only hours earlier. Suddenly, they seemed impossible to overlook. And as he walked toward the exit, Ethan Caldwell understood something that no boardroom, no investor meeting, and no billion-dollar negotiation had ever managed to teach him. Respect is not earned by power. It is revealed by character. 3 months later, the video was still being discussed in business schools, leadership podcasts, and corporate boardrooms across the country. What began as a single uncomfortable moment inside a Manhattan restaurant had evolved into something much larger. Millions of people had watched the footage. But what surprised many observers was not the public. Embarrassment. It was what happened afterward. Caldwell Dynamics did not issue a carefully scripted press release blaming misunderstanding or context. Instead, Ethan Caldwell did something few expected. He listened. The emergency board meeting the following morning lasted nearly 8 hours. By the end of it, Ethan had agreed to commission an independent cultural review of the company. Anonymous employee surveys were expanded. Leadership training became mandatory for every executive, including Ethan himself. Quarterly town hall meetings were introduced, allowing employees at every level to speak directly with senior leadership. Some critics dismissed the changes as damage control. Others remained skeptical. Change, after all, is easy to announce and much harder to sustain. But over time, something remarkable happened. Employee retention improved. Internal satisfaction scores climbed. Productivity increased. People who had once remained silent slowly found their voices. And perhaps for the first time since founding Caldwell Dynamics, Ethan began learning as much from his employees as they learned from him. 6 months after that unforgettable evening, Ethan returned to Maison Lumiere. Alone. No investors. No assistants. No cameras. It was a Friday night. The restaurant glowed with the same warm elegance. Soft jazz floated through the dining room. Candlelight reflected across polished glass and silver. And just as before, Naomi Brooks moved gracefully between tables wearing the same simple black uniform. Some things Ethan had learned do not need to change. Naomi noticed him immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell," she said warmly. Ethan smiled. "Good evening, Ms. Brooks." This time, there was no tension between them. Only mutual respect. Naomi guided him to a quiet table near the windows overlooking the city skyline. As she prepared to leave, Ethan spoke. "I wanted to thank you." Naomi looked curious. "For what?" Ethan glanced around the restaurant. "For not humiliating me when you easily could have." Naomi smiled softly. "Humiliation rarely teaches people anything. Dignity does." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood now. Truly understood. Success had once convinced him that power meant being the loudest voice in the room. Naomi had taught him something entirely different. Real power often speaks softly. Real leadership notices people others overlook. Real character reveals itself not during moments of triumph, but during moments when kindness costs nothing and respect is optional. Outside, New York continued rushing forward beneath a sea of lights, full of strangers crossing paths every day without knowing how profoundly they might affect one another. Because the truth is simple. The people we dismiss today may shape our future tomorrow. The people we overlook may carry wisdom we desperately need. And the people we believe have no power often possess the one thing money can never buy: grace. Naomi never raised her voice. She never demanded respect. She simply lived in a way that made disrespect impossible to justify. And on one unforgettable night in Manhattan, a billionaire entered Maison Lumiere believing he owned the room. He left understanding that character, not wealth, is what truly commands it.